Thank you, Rose. As Rose mentioned, I'm from LaunchVic, which those of you who don't know is a government agency tasked with growing the startup sector here in Victoria. We're pretty active, so if we haven't reached you, I'd be surprised. How many of you out there know of LaunchVic? Oh, good. We got a good, great shout out at the Melbourne Entrepreneurial Gala, which we've also supported going forward. So just to kick off, I actually wanted Kunal and Mark to introduce themselves and give us a brief bio on their work and what they're doing.
Hello. Yeah, cool. Hi, I'm Kunal. I'm the founder and CEO of Eugene, and essentially what we do is we offer at-home genetic tests to help people make smarter health choices at every stage of their life, starting with helping people plan a healthy pregnancy. So our first product is a pre or early pregnancy checkup for partners to know their risk of passing on serious genetic diseases to their children. That's what we do.
Mark?
Mark Hargreaves. I'm a professor of physiology at the University of Melbourne with an interest in exercise physiology, and a Pro Vice-Chancellor for research collaboration and partnerships, a job which had its origins many years ago as facilitating the links between the university and many of our partners in the Melbourne Biomedical Precinct. But it's evolved a little bit since then. So.
Awesome. I think one of the things we'll dig into a little bit later is that intersect of entrepreneurship and research and how we encourage more of that. And particularly, Kunal, you are from a technology background now working in health, so we'll get to that shortly. One of the things, though, is worth kicking off the discussion with is the fact that here in Victoria we have a very strong health sector. It contributes $30 billion annually to the economy. In startups alone, we know that it's employing a quarter of the people working within that startup sector. What are the sort of contributing factors you see to making this such a strong ecosystem? Mark?
So our research strategy is people, collaboration and settings at the university, and I would argue that's what makes this work. We have very talented people, and that becomes a virtuous circle because young, enthusiastic, highly motivated doctors, students who want to make a difference and have impact will want to work with the best people if they can. And so it becomes, as I said, a virtual circle. We've got history on our side. So the university's been there for over 160 years. The hospital moved up in the 1940s. The university and the Royal Melbourne got together to establish the Walter and Eliza Hall back in the 1915 when they recognised that there needed to be a nexus between research and healthcare. So there's many factors, and then of course governments invest. There's serious state and federal government investment in the Melbourne Biomedical Precinct and surrounds. So and then getting people to work together. It's not always as easy as it sounds, and you can't legislate collaboration, but over time, relationships develop, and that then speaks to the value of co-location precincts. And then governments, universities try and make it as easy, reduce the transaction costs of doing research, which is often challenging as well. And we might get onto some of the very important ethical and privacy issues, particularly in health, that need to be addressed, and Kunal would be well aware of those and others. So not making it overly bureaucratic, but ensuring that rights and are protected, and particularly the vulnerable. So.
Yeah, I am going to start backward, but yeah, regulations actually really important. Good regulations really important in any sort of especially in the health industry. So I know that there's this idea that entrepreneurs and commercial organizations really don't like regulation, don't want to deal with it. And in some ways it is obviously burdensome, but there is a good burden, and then there is just a pointless burden. And it's important to differentiate between the two. I think Australia sits pretty well in that middle ground where the regulation that we deal with is, we see that as yeah, of course, that's a bare minimum. We care far more about the privacy of our customers than anyone else. So if people are complaining about regulation in Australia, I'd be worried. Like as a founder, I'd be worried about that organization's interest in like the safety and privacy of their customers. To answer your question, I think that I think you're right. Like I think the collaboration between research and hospitals and government has been really good. I think we need to do more to bring entrepreneurs, founders, startups into the fray, because this is like, whether we like it or not, the next like generation of how products are built, how companies are built, and how people find and access new technologies. Right now, what we're finding is that we've found ourselves in the sweet spot where we've actually managed to like combine all of those little bits and pieces. But I know that a lot of founders, a lot of companies struggle to engage with research, to engage with public health, to engage with health professionals. And we really need to make that easier to do.
So, Mark, I think we hear quite often that is one of the biggest challenges as well. How can universities, what can they do to kind of encourage and unlock that sort of research and give entrepreneurs more access to ideas coming out of universities? How do we build that sort of bridge?
So I think the fundamental prerequisite of that is to ensure that there are good ideas and good research. So that's the role of the university. And then the ecosystem will then try and take advantage of that. So for good. And the university, of course, is looking to derive more benefit for the communities that it serves, locally, nationally, and globally. And that's translating research to impact. So there's a cultural piece to that. It's the rewards and recognition structures that we have within the university that celebrate particular things, not just Nature papers and Nobel Prizes, but patents and invention disclosures. And Graham Clark is often held up as a great example of fundamental research translated into a product that had global benefit and impact. So there are policy frameworks, there are incentives. Government can get involved with that. The sort of structure of the economy is challenging. We're largely an SME base, but we do have large companies. CSL have recently announced their move into the Parkville area, and that's going to further catalyse, again, the critical mass, the opportunity for people to come together. So, it's a work in progress, and I think there's certainly no shortage of awareness about what needs to be done, and then it's how do we encourage that as best we can.
Kunal, a specific question for you. How did you come from technology into health? I guess that could be an interesting, answer for people here.
Yeah, so I spent like probably a decade building companies not in healthcare, and after my last one, I wanted to work on something that was a little bit more meaningful, and I wanted to apply all of these skills that I had acquired around creating products that are easy to use, that people like to engage, people like to use, and apply that in an industry that I felt sorely needed it, and health is one of them. People don't like to engage with health professionals. People don't like to engage with healthcare in general. Like, you ask someone whether they like to go to their naturopath, and they're like, yes, I love them. They're so great. They listen to me and they care for me. You ask them if they like to go to their GP, and they're like, nah. Like those are like, one of them is like alternative medicine, and complementary, but not the answer to everything. And yet people like to engage with that a little bit more because people feel like they're heard and they're cared for. I thought that there was this unique opportunity to actually use all these skills that we've acquired in technology and like building products that people like and people like to engage with, and bring that to healthcare where it's so important. It's so important. And so many of us spend our lives ignoring it because it's too hard. And that shouldn't be the case. So that's kind of why I wanted to do that.
And then how do you go about entering that as an industry you have no experience in?
With great difficulty. I spent 3 years just like trying to understand the space and find like interesting problems that exist within this space. Once I found the problem that I was passionate about, I just started to talk to anyone that was willing to talk to me, researchers, clinicians, doctors, like hospital administrators, everyone that I could talk to about that problem and how it affected them, how it could be addressed, and eventually met some people who were just as passionate about that problem as I was, in their own way, and started a company with them. Like, we have I understand that I'm the CEO without a health background, but like my co-founder is is a genetic counselor and our medical director is a clinical geneticist. We're not like half-assing this. Uh, we've got like real medical professionals behind us, and that's because we were able to bring together a group of people, whether they're technologists, designers, health professionals, together to work on the same problem. Because if you remove all the layers, all the shit, all the politics, all the everything else, you have a group of people who care. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here, right? Like, so that's how I managed to do that.
So how do you think, Mark, in hearing that story, and Kunal for you as well, when we're talking about building things like Melbourne Connect and these sort of precincts, are these the sort of outcomes we're hoping for, and how can we make sure that these sorts of relationships develop organically?
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly, the underlying principle is, the power of co-location and all of the sort of economic geography that's been around for hundreds of years, catalysed more recently with, the notion of innovation districts and enterprise precincts and all of those sorts of things. It's evolved organically somewhat, although in more recent times with active curation from the university and the government in the Melbourne biomedical precinct. So it's about, and I think, people, it comes back to people. I think it's interesting, some of you may have read the work of Eric Topol in recent times. His most recent book is called Deep Medicine, and he talks about how technology and AI can be used for deep phenotyping, deep learning, and then that frees up the humans to do the deep empathy, and that he uses that terminology. And it's very easy, and I've seen it in exercise science as well. You can get very scientific and very technical and lose sight of, how would any of sports science perhaps predicted the events last Sunday in the cricket, which is, the beauty of sport from my perspective is the unpredictability. There was an English physician in the 1700s who was quite successful, and he had a saying that it was much more important to understand which patient had the disease than which disease had the patient. And whatever technologies he had at that time, whether it was listening and observing and taking a long history, he ended up being quite financially successful at the time and actually invested some of his money in research at the time with the tools they had. So, the Deloitte report on the future of work is human. I think we have to remember that, yes, in a digital world where robots, yes, may take over some things, that fundamentally we're human, we're social, that's how we evolved. And I think that's the potential in health, is to not replace the doctor, but help the doctor and the full health professional team. And as an exercise person, then, prevention, behaviours, all of the sort of gadgets and things that are out there that facilitate, behaviour change, Fitbits that tell you haven't walked enough and all of those sorts of things. There's quite an exciting opportunity. The Mars precinct in Toronto, which was medical and related sciences, actually the early commercial successes were in the related sciences because some of the digital and tech thresholds were lower. And now there's a large number of companies in that ecosystem that are bringing together the technology and the medical in interesting ways. So
I like that. I like how technology is taking us forward, but it's our humanity that's really going to be the power in the future. What do you see as some of the big challenges then in health tech going forward? Is it this overemphasis on technology over, knowledge? What are the big challenges we sort of face in this area?
So these are all my personal opinions. I think one of the challenges that we face is the tribal nature of humans. I don't know if I can like explain that a little bit better, but basically we like create these walls as like, oh no, that person is this thing and that's different, right? Like it's we do that in industries, you know, like, oh, like I'm a founder, I don't like health people are blah. Health people are like, oh, like they're tech people, like they're always like this. It's like we need to, that's one of the challenges, like the walls that we've created around us for no good reason, in my personal opinion. Of course, that extends to like all kinds of different categories of humans. So that's one, because that's what's driving this behavior of like, let's just use technology to do this because like we can't be bothered dealing with health people. So I think that's one of the challenges. The other challenge is that we have this over reliance on technology to solve a problem, but healthcare is actually beyond just solving a problem. It is actually about caring for a person. And I think that's the piece that sometimes people miss. In San Francisco, there are these new startups that have like a health clinic with no people inside. So you just go in there and like literally there's just like machines that like do everything and it looks pristine, looks like an Apple store. And people are like, this is so amazing. And the whole time I was there, people are like, are you excited about this? I'm like, no. No, I'm not excited about this. I don't want to go to I'm like, if I'm sick, I want to talk to someone. So like we have an opportunity that allows us to engage with this and build products and services that actually do that. But if no one is going to do that, that's what's coming. So like all of the people that care about compassion, all of the people that care about empathy, you can't just sit on the sidelines. You have to get in the game. And I think that's what's happening right now. The challenge is that the people that are in the game are the ones that like just want to remove the humanity of it. And so that's the second challenge in my personal opinion.
Mark, any challenges you see for the industry going forward?
Well, I think the economy of health is a challenge. Costs just keep going up and up and up, and that's unsustainable. And there are some jurisdictions where they have to make rationing choices. And how can you do that? How can you value, a premature baby versus a genetically determined disease versus, and then there'll be value judgments about if there's a behavioural element. Well, that's their fault. I mean, smoking, where does that begin and end in other behaviours? So I think that's challenging. So, but the paradox is, at one level we're trying to generate wealth from our intellectual property in the health area, but into a system that is struggling to contain the costs within a health system. So how do we do that? There are new models of looking at validating. Clearly, we want to have devices and therapeutic interventions that are scientifically valid, justified, safe, and effective. So you don't want to shorten the development process, but virtual clinical trials, organoids, IPS, stem cells from patients to try and validate therapeutic targets in a more efficient way, perhaps, to try and lower the cost of development of these therapeutic. And then prevention. There's a Chinese saying that, a bad doctor will treat disease, an average doctor will recognize disease, and a good doctor will prevent disease, as something like that. So how do we, early detection, some of the technologies around early detection. Genetic testing is part of it, but not the only thing. As a physiologist, of course, the gene-environment interaction is very important. And so a whole lot of SNPs may be important, but a tape measure or a fasting glucose measure may give you as much information of the integration of all of those things as, but then if you want to understand things more, you need to do that deep phenotyping, which is all of the omic technologies. And then, of course, all of the environmental sensors, the microbiome, all of the environmental challenges that we face, understanding all of that, which is, it becomes then a big data analysis exercise, which is where the new technologies can perhaps be brought to bear.
Sorry, I'm going to add on a couple things to that. Yeah, totally agree with everything you said, and especially around the health economics and value judgments that we place. on people and like how we decide. The biggest challenge around that as well is that how can you still represent the individual's interest, because it's not fair for us to make value judgments for everyone. And so how can you still represent the individual interest while still making decisions for the society? And where does that disconnect, or how do you connect those two? That's incredibly challenging, especially in genetics. When we talk about like recessive disease prevention, when we talk about like considering IVF and other technologies to avoid passing on disease, there are so many ethical quandaries that no one should be making decisions for this stuff in a vacuum. And how governments and how governments can engage everyday people to make those decisions, when in reality, in many cases, neither of them fully understand the like technology or like the impact of the technology. How are we going to do this? So that's like, I think that's like incredibly challenging.
The Australian Genomic Health Alliance and the work that Kathy North has led through the Murdoch Children's Research Institute around looking at, where can whole genome and whole exome sequencing make a difference, and where is the benefit marginal? And there are some conditions where, in terms of the fixed costs and also the human cost of the diagnostic journey, can be markedly reduced with some simple genomic testing in certain conditions. In others, it's less effective. And so the notion of precision care, precision medicine, broadly defined, I think is what's evolving at the moment. I mean, precision oncology is perhaps at the forefront, but I think that's going to be an opportunity. And a comprehensive university that has expertise in the mathematical sciences, the engineering sciences, but also in the social sciences around ethics, law, regulation. We have a very strong group coming together in AI and digital ethics. We have a very strong group that's a collaboration with Oxford around health technologies and the notion of dynamic consent in a changing health workplace. How do we respect individual rights and access? And of course, the vulnerable. We have a disability institute, and one of their mantras is that designing for disability is designing for all. And how do we make sure that people don't get left behind, that there's equitable access to many of these emerging technologies?
How do we make sure that happens? I mean, it's all very well for us to sit here and say, this is what we should be doing. But, you're working day to day on a discovery or in your company and you're making commercial decisions. How do we make sure that ethics and the broader picture of what it is we're all, aiming for is something that stays front of mind for people working in this area?
Great question. Once again, my answer is going to be with great difficulty. So I think that, for us, that was the reason why we started this company. We felt that there was a vacuum in the decision-making process around genetics or understanding about genetics in a way that wasn't really serving the future goals of us as a society. And one of the reasons we started Eugene was to help everyday people engage with genetics in a way that they could understand. Because right now, one of the biggest challenges that we face is that people don't know what this stuff means. So they don't even know the challenges ahead. Right now, 80% of global genomic studies only include people of North European ancestry. The reality of that is insane. That is 7% of the world's population. And all of the organizations around the world that are doing research in genomics are really just like doing research on 7% of only include 7% of the world's population. So when we talk about precision medicine, the rest of us are going to be left behind if we're not included in research. And even though governments are spending lots of money trying to sequence like a diverse group of people, right now, for example, in the US, 23andMe has the largest genomic data set in the US than every other data set combined. That is the power of commercial organizations. And I think that like organizations like government and like universities and research, they need to engage with commercial organizations that can drive access. And we are just as interested in equitable access as anyone else. And so, like, just because it's a commercial organization doesn't mean that it can't drive access or be equitable, because we expect that only government's supposed to do that. I don't believe that's the case. I think the future is conscious capitalism, and conscious capitalism, when embedded within an organization from the very start, drives a culture of behavior where every day you ask the question, it's like, is this actually accessible? Like, when people tell us this is not accessible, we're like, okay, how can we make it so? Oh, can we spread out payments? Yep, let's do that. Can we provide discounts to anyone with low-income health cards? Yes, let's do that. So every day we make decisions around access. So that's how we keep things above, like, ethical. It's part of the core of the organization, and as we grow, that's going to be our responsibilities as leaders within the organization to make sure it maintains. And I'm inherently fireable. So, like, if I build a company that is driven by access, if I get fired, the entire organization is still driven by access, because that is what we built. And, like, anyone that comes in still has to fulfill that remit. So it's complicated, it's hard, but it can be done.
Any thoughts, Mark?
I think that's, I mean, if we look at recent events in the financial industry, about at one level there's shareholder value, at another level there's customer satisfaction, there's a public good. So those inevitable debates around the roles of the private sector, the public sector, in all of that. And I think government certainly has a role in terms of regulation. We as a university responded over the last 6 to 12 months on a number of papers from the Human Rights Commission around technologies and AI. And there's a fine line between regulation and over-regulation, and which stifles innovation. And so it's finding the balance between protecting rights, privacy, but also having a framework that allows some innovation and the value that can be derived from data linkage and those sorts of things. So it's complex. I think conscious capitalism, I think that's a nice term.
I like it too. What are the next big things on the horizon, do you think, for health tech? Is AI that's going to be that really drives us to the next frontier? Have either of you got thoughts on what you think is going to be the next big shift in this sector?
I mean, it's a great question. I think
I didn't give this one any forewarning on this one. It is a heavy one.
No, I mean, there's so much stuff going on that I think it's like hard to predict. Obviously, AI is like really big. I think we're just beginning to scratch the surface on genetics and what it can mean for us. And I mean, when we talk about genetics, like I also want to include like other next generation technologies like microbiome screening and things like that. Like, we are just beginning to understand what this means. Like I said, the representation is so poor. So like, there is so much catching up to do for everyone else. I still think that's going to be the next big thing, but that's obviously a biased answer since that is where I work. But I also think that yes, AI is going to play a big role, especially because as we start to amass more and more and more data, it becomes much more reasonable to use these types of technologies to actually help us mine that and understand what's happening. It's the combinations, the data and the AI.
Mark, any thoughts on next big changes?
Yeah, look, I think the technologies certainly are there, but I think we need to recognise them for what they are, which are tools to help us as a means to an end. And if it's improved health outcomes, prolonged health span rather than just lifespan, I read a recent review that the future of the management of non-communicable disease will be digital, where there'll be connection of primary community networks with expertise and technologies that will help. As a physiologist, I'm sort of interested in the phenotype, not just the genotype, and how is that what are the influences on that? How do we better understand the things that create the environments that allow certain behaviours to become predominant or not? And how can we use technologies perhaps in creative ways to facilitate that? I think we certainly need to move to a prevention strategy, and if we can use the technologies in a cost-effective way to optimize treatments, personalized 3D printing of implants. So instead of every prosthesis coming off as it is, it might be customized to a particular patient, their particular anatomy from scanning, their particular biology. Stem cells might be used, biocompatible materials. There's a whole lot of interesting things. And even on the AI, I mean, we need to remember that the algorithms are often derived from a construct. And if that is a white Anglo-Saxon professor of physiology, then that may not be the algorithm that is optimal in a range of populations. So it's the data that goes in, and it's the rules that are used to frame the algorithm that comes out of it. So that's also needs to be considered. So.
I'm just going to add one more thing there. So one of the other trends that I've been seeing is that, the future of cities itself and how that's going to impact how healthcare is delivered. So people are moving further and further away from city centers because, housing's becoming more expensive, and there's like, a lot of population growth and so on and so forth. How can we deliver the same quality of care to people further away is something that we really need to spend more time thinking about. And so everything at Eugene is digital, right? So we serve customers whether they live in like Melbourne CBD or whether they live in Darwin, right? And that is unique, because if you were in Darwin, you would have had to wait for a geneticist or a clinic or a genetic counselor to come once every like 6 months for like 2 days. What's that? What? Exactly. And that doesn't need to be the case, especially in like a field like preventative medicine or genetics, where you don't need to be there in person. Like I can have a call, I can just like call you, and that works just the same. And so we're creating opportunities to provide high quality care to everyone, no matter where they are. And for the future of cities to be sustainable, where people are moving out further and further away, we need to have more of these opportunities of access to digital health or healthcare in a way that works for them, and that looks like at-home care. That doesn't mean someone has to go there. That just means that health professionals need to get used to the idea that maybe you can just like do this thing on a video call. Maybe you can do it in a different way.
We're going to throw to questions. So I'm sure we've had a wide-ranging discussion. We've touched on everything. Conscious capitalism. We've got a mic.
I'll just repeat that. I was just asking who owns the data. So obviously with all the genomic data that's generated from customers sequencing themselves, is just wondering where that goes.
So we don't commercialize that data, and we're an early stage company. So like there's many reasons to not do that right now. But in general, like the customer owns their genomic data. If they provide specific consent for that to be used, de-identified, and used in research, that is entirely like their decision. And when we say consent, we don't mean like sign this thing like 40 pages long. We mean like, hey, do you understand what this means? Are you fully clear? If you're still okay, fine. But if you're not okay, that's also perfectly fine. We still provide you with the same quality of care.
Yep.
I wanted to know what the connection between Melbourne Connect and the rest of the medical precinct was. My impression of Melbourne Connect is that it's a sort of an engineering and tech type of place, but and a lot of the other research is being done in kind of other parts. But I'm sure there's an opportunity to correct me.
Mark?
Well, I don't think you need to be corrected. The sort of academic rationale for Melbourne Connect is still an evolving feast, and it has been since it started way back in 2000 and 2011 or so, when there was thinking around, engineering in the context of societal challenges and pervasive information, as it was termed in some of the early briefing documents about, how do we use emerging technologies to understand some of these things. I think as it's evolved, and of course the major tenant is going to be our School of Computing and Information Systems, and the digital from the university's tenancy. As we've seen, the whole digital transformation applies across many areas. So there'll be a commitment in Melbourne Connect to the fundamental research that underpins developments in that space. It's a discipline that is nurtured in its own right, not just the handmaiden of other sectors that use digital technologies, as well as exploring the opportunities. So I think in the data space, in the digital space, which is becoming pervasive, but particularly in medicine, that's the opportunity. So our data engineers will be able to look at, how do hospitals construct databases in such a way that they can be interrogated more easily and safely in the future. So I think the digital and data futures is a theme that is sort of beginning to crystallize, and that will then connect. So we have the West Parkville precinct and the East Parkville precinct, and it's all connected with a big train line. So
we'll wait and see. There's just one question at the back there, and we'll come forward.
Thank you, Kunal. By all accounts, your startup has a very high reputation within the genetics community. I was just talking to a couple of my ex-colleagues online. However, in the health innovation space, we see two things, I think, over the years I reflect on, having been sort of involved in this for 20 odd years. One is overpromise. So one is the things that we promise as developments which will actually have public health benefit we can't ultimately deliver on. And perhaps we're getting closer to that in genetics at the moment, but we see a lot of that in cancer, a lot of that in other health innovations. So what's the role of startups and of Melbourne Connect in ensuring that we don't be part of that overpromise or part of that hype? But the other thing we often see is a race to the bottom. And we see this in all sorts of other tech innovations. So we saw 23andMe closed down by the regulators for, a couple of years. We've seen international players come into this genetic testing space, and they're always going to undercut you on price. They're always going to promise to do a whole bunch of things which you think is ethically not sound, what's the role again of startups and of something like Melbourne Connect, in shaping these discussions? Because otherwise it seems to me that you're going to be undercut, and there's going to be, the bottom line is going to come under you, and you're not going to be in business anymore.
That's a great question. I sort of disagree with parts of it. So I think for us, like I said, like when I'm talking about a startup, it's still a capitalist enterprise, right? And so, but I think people are changing. So yes, price is a component, but people care about things that are like greater than price. That's why the Whole Foods movement is so crazy, that someone's willing to pay like, $20 for like a thing of asparagus because it says it's organic. So like people are not as price conscious as we might think they are. People care about the services that are being offered to them. People care about being cared for. I think the reality of 23andMe is that we can see what their customers do with their health data, like what they get out of it, and we can see what customers who use Eugene get out of it. And customers who use Eugene get a lot more out of it than what you get out of 23andMe. So they might charge like half the price, but they're not going to be able to deliver on the quality of service that we will. And as a result of that, customers, I believe, will choose us still. And in reality, 23andMe, like one of the easiest, so we do get asked this question. So like, price is still important, and people still ask like, hey, why is this so much cheaper? But if you look at 23andMe, on their own website, they say, you can't use this stuff to make health choices. You can't use this stuff to make health decisions. Your doctor will not use this stuff. So like, we never say that because like we make sure that the stuff that we provide people, their doctors can use it, that you can use it to make health choices. And so there are fundamental differences in the product that they're selling and the product that we're selling. I understand it's genetics, but it's still not the same product. We're selling a health service and they're selling, I don't know, recreational goods. So I think that's like a primary difference. I can't comment on the Melbourne Connect thing though, so I'm gonna leave that one to you.
I think there's no question that there's the technology is way ahead of the biology in some places, particularly in my area in genetic testing for sport. When I came last in the 100 and first in the 1500, I had a pretty good idea that maybe I wasn't made out to be a sprinter and maybe better at more of the endurance type activities. So, and that's not to downplay in any way the role of genetic testing, because in searching to understand the biology, those technologies have a lot of value, and there are new insights that are provided by a greater understanding of the biology to then move forward. But in some of the areas, I mean, Moore's law, it's a law, it's happening. The biology validation is a little bit behind all that in my mind. As far as Melbourne Connect is concerned, I mean, as a university, our core business is education and research. That's what we do. That's how we contribute to the knowledge base that informs practice. And Melbourne Connect is designed to better connect us and engage us with some of the problems out there in our communities, some of which we might be able to solve, some of which we can only solve if we work together with those partners, align our priorities. And I think universities are important civic institutions, but they're not the only ones. And I don't think we have an important role to play in the whole ecosystem, but we're not the only player. So I think working together and collaborating is really the fundamental part of Melbourne Connect. The name is there for a reason, which is to connect us more effectively with our communities and translate our research activity into the next generation of leaders through education, but then the knowledge that's going to inform future change.
I was just gonna. I'm glad to hear that people in the genetics community our reputation is good. That's good to hear.
Good morning, everyone. Penelope Lane from the commercialisation team at Melbourne Uni, just for your insight. Obviously, healthcare innovation really relies on interdisciplinary teams and collaborative thinking. I'm really interested, Mark in particular, but to the whole panel, human aspect creates the culture, and I'm really interested in the proactive mindset that sits in sports and human performance technology sector. It's a sector that is very proactive, obviously, to avoid injury. What might we learn from that technology, which is very similar to our medical technologies, to take that human aspect and that culture of proactivity to make our health industries more proactive as opposed to reactive?
It's a good point, and the reason Melbourne's such a great place to live in is that you've got great educational research institutions, you have great cultural institutions, you have a great sporting tradition, and sport. For whatever reason, some would argue disproportionately, captures the imagination of people. But in a sporting context where let's look at the AFL, where there's a desire to be successful, there are lots of things, innovations that are tried. You look at what they've tried. Some clubs have dabbled in what we might consider the dark side of performance enhancement. But there's a lot of innovation that occurs in a sporting context or an elite performance context. In the arts, there's a lot of creativity in the arts. There's a lot of creativity in sporting to try and get a competitive advantage that ultimately will translate, not dissimilar from defence. Unfortunately, there are conflicts, but often in those conflicts, it catalyses a lot of development and research that has considerable societal benefit, notwithstanding where it came from. So I think health and well-being, broadly defined, is something where Melbourne has quite a We have some great institutions. Some of our Deacon's sports science department was number 1 in the world for a couple of years. It's number 3 now, which is still pretty good. Australia has 10 or 12 of the top 25 sports science departments on academic merit. Now, how do you then translate that into benefit? Not just on the sporting field, but in the wider area. And wearable technologies, a lot of those technologies had their beginnings in monitoring athletes, heart rate sensors, oxygen uptake measurements, those sorts of things. So
thank you. Could I just ask a little sort of subline to that? What I also see in sports technology and human performance technology is that the technologists, the entrepreneurs are closer to the game or the team than doctors and entrepreneurs are in the clinic. Is it just the regulatory environment of healthcare, or are there other barriers? Clearly, sports technology isn't hard to raise for, unlike health technologies. So are there other barriers that are stopping that connection?
So, I mean, I like to throw some support to our colleagues in the public health system. They're slammed. They're slammed. There's so many people, and most of them that are seeing them are sick. So it's really hard. I think it's easier in sports science because everyone's quite healthy and young, right? It's easy to stay ahead of the game. But if you have 100 patients and most of them already have cancer, and you need to run a genetic test or better understand what type of cancer it is and how to best treat it. If someone is coming in to do proactive genetic testing to understand the risk of breast cancer, for example, it's reasonable to say that actually we can't see you right now. That's a fair, it's unfair for the person to have that experience, but it's
but should our funding models change to support that proactive approach?
I mean, yes. Yes, the short answer is yes. But there's a role that organizations commercial organizations can play to make that kind of testing more available and accessible. So it isn't just a public health thing. It is a collaboration, as it always comes back to, collaboration between public health, between commercial organizations, between government, to sort of create a new model of healthcare that drives us forward into prevention. But it's not going to happen with and that requires us to know that it's not going to happen with the current model.
Yeah,
we
no,
actually
obviously.
just released a report on sports tech in Victoria.
Yeah, I was at the event. It was really good.
And so it also has some challenges, and it's actually not as well supported commercially as people often think. It's just as hard for those companies to raise.
Tech stars should make a difference.
Yes, we hope so. And the other challenge, of course, in sports tech is because it's such a competitive environment, there often isn't a lot of collaboration. So when something is, involving within a sports club, they're not likely to share that across the ecosystem. In fact, they hold it very close to their heart. So it has some different challenges, but it's certainly not got the collaboration that you might have in other areas of health.
I should say that to this day, most of our referrals and most of our customers come from doctors, from other health professionals, because they themselves are recognizing that they don't have the space, they don't have the funding, they don't have the ability to serve everyone. And that's okay, because there are other organizations that are also willing to help like us. So we are seeing that collaboration. It is happening. It's just in its infancy.
Hi there, I'm Doug Boyle. I'm an Associate Professor in Health Data Science at Melbourne. And I think it's great we're hearing that we need to move to preventative strategies. And one stat I heard a while ago was that our entire GDP would go on healthcare if we don't change the way we work by 2046, which is not very far away. The problem for government, I guess, with preventative health strategies is that if you put billions into prevention, how can politicians see what that is doing? But yeah, how can they see the value? It's a major issue for us in that health data science. And so hopefully from our health data science community, we can start making it more possible for politicians to demonstrate to their electorate the advantages in prevention strategies and things. changing. But certainly the current Australian digital health strategy isn't about prevention. That's we do need foundational components. It's good for that. So it's good at looking at some of the key things we need in infrastructure. But it's kind of interesting in the sort of app space and in the innovation space. And it's really great to hear what you're doing there, Kunal, and that you're doing things for the right reasons. But one of the things I really am keen about, and it'd be good to just get your thoughts, is I think we need holistic care, not just pockets. And that's one of the challenges right now. The strategy from government around things like app and health space is to leave it entirely up to commercial organisations to take that forward. And that means that you're having, as a commercial entity, to look at where the sweet spots are. So it makes it very difficult for Australia really to offer the level of care across the whole range of things that you might want to achieve. So I'm hopeful that, we get more organisations like yourself, Kamal, but also that we can all impact what might come around in the next round of government strategy to promote a prevention-based focus.
Yeah, I think that's good. I think the NDIS and some of the commentary out of health about, and it ties a little bit in with the aspirations of digital services. And again, there's a fine line between becoming impersonal and customized. And so how do you maintain the empathy and the human connection there within a resource? And it shouldn't be seen as cost cutting and efficiency, but as optimization. But data sharing, and so for individual people with disability or their families and carers, a package that is customized to their particular needs, which is a bit of education and a bit of core support and a bit of training or whatever. There might be ways in which there's always been a lot of rhetoric around joining up whole of government services, but how do you do that in ways where human services, health, justice, and then that's sharing information. So that then requires the trust and the reciprocity and the systems and the confidence that in the systems and the integrity that underpin the ability to do that. So.
Great. I think we've got time for one more question. So just over here.
Thank you. It's a very interesting panel. I just noticed that the room is quite north-south divide, and I was hoping to hear more from the back and their interests. On health and technology and innovation collaboration, what is the advances in, say, intergenerational and dealing with aging Australia and elderly and technology and startup and spaces? So that sits kind of not in the preventative, healthy, strong history of Australia, but I'd like to hear what your thoughts are on that. And also from anyone in the room, even if it's after.
I think I've seen quite a few really cool innovations that are like we've all got aging parents at this stage, and so for me the interest is both personal and from a industry perspective, and some of the really cool innovations. I'm gonna have to remember the name of this company before I finish pitching them. But they create and they put sensors in the homes of people. So instead of monitoring them, instead of calling them every day and the only question you ask your parents is did you get out of bed? It's that they don't want to be infantilized, so they prefer not to have those conversations. But these sensors are allowing carers to monitor, hey, okay, cool, mom actually got out of bed this morning, she opened the fridge, she made her coffee, she made her tea, and it allows you then, when you are having those conversations with your parents, it's hey, what'd you do for breakfast? You're actually having much more thoughtful conversations. So there's stuff like that that's happening. There's obviously a significant increase in the availability of digital care or at-home care, and that's helping. I think obviously we all need to recognize that we're all going to live longer than we probably expect. It's a really fascinating space, and I think there's a lot of really cool organizations working on some really cool things for the elderly. There, yeah.
Health.
Bad at names. I don't remember.
Gabrielle was the name someone mentioned.
Yeah, I don't have much to add. I think again, having had a deceased parent go through the aged care system, it's a challenging time because you'd like to think that we could keep your parents in their home for as long as they can, and it goes back to health span and lifespan, and that has a prevention element as well. But then, for whatever reason, the onset of chronic disease, the best predictor of chronic disease is aging, and if you live long enough, you'll get something. So that needs to be managed. So I think is it Silvercoin? Is that the company Dale Fisher went to after Peter Mac? Was about in-home care, not just for the elderly, but for most people. So some of those innovations around how you provide personalised care, the design of aged care facilities. We have groups at the university who are very interested in the built environment and how that can facilitate communities of. So yes, they have people looking after them, but they have a sense that this is their home. And we have this issue with students where we, with the best of intentions in monitoring their habits around their study, when does that become surveillance? And I think it's a similar sort of thing. Our elderly like to be independent, and that includes a whole range of things. And just as our kids like to be independent, I suspect our parents, elderly parents, would like to be independent. So it's balancing those. Again, it's the human ethical. It's respect, trust, reciprocity in that system that is going to make it work. So.
Okay, thanks everyone. Thanks for being such an engaged audience and for those fantastic questions. So I think that's a wrap.
That's a wrap. Everyone give a big round of applause for Bronwen, Kunal and Mark.